Institute for Indigenous Health Research monthly webinar series. My name is Suzanne Stewart, and I'm the director of the Waakabenez Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health Research at the Dalalana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto here in Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territory. I'm very excited and happy to have Dr. Michael Hart from the University of Calgary and traditional knowledge keeper Clayton Shirt, the elder in residence here at Waakabenez Bryce, here with me today. And I'm welcoming all the attendees I see pouring in. So thank you and apologies for the delay. We had some technical issues, but our wonderful NEIHR coordinator, Roy Strebel, was able to remediate those. So Massey Cho, Roy. Maybe what I'll do before we get started with introductions is I will invite Clay to open us up with spiritual words and a prayer so that we can start the day grounded in our culture and a ceremony.
Miigwech, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Suzanne. I just want to say Miigwech. I just want to thank you all for allowing me to say this simple prayer, try to live by it every day of my life. Welcome to everyone. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy that you're all here in a good way, wherever you are, and we all come together in this virtual circle as the people. So I just say thank you to all of you for attending in these very difficult, challenging times we're all in. With that, I just want to say, I'm going to say a prayer in this language. I don't really speak my language that well. I understand it. I am Ojibwe in Cree and also a little bit of Irish there, but I understand the languages enough, but I don't speak it that well. So I just want to say it in this language. So it's kind of, it's difficult, I think, to say it in English, and I'll try to translate when I listen to my elders speak. And I just want to say, Miigwech, I always begin with, we say thank you to our first mother of all mothers. We humble ourselves as the people. We give thanks and gratitude. Again, we pray to her, we pray for her. We give thanks to our first mother of all mothers, our mother, the earth, in a good way, in a kind way. We ask her for her blessings to help us in these difficult, challenging times. We send our voice, our heart to her. We thank her for everything she provides for us, the people and our relatives, the four-leggeds, the crawlers, the swimmers, the flyers. We give thanks to her for everything she does for us. We love her. We say Miigwech to her. So our minds and our hearts can be one with this. We say Miigwech to her. We send our voices, our hearts, our minds to Father Sky. Again, we offer our Sema. We partition. We offer our Sema to Father Sky. We partition, we ask the spirits of our ancestors, those good ones, those kind ones, those loving ones who are there with us always, to be with us in a good way, physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally. We give thanks to our ancestors wherever we may be. I ask that they bless us with good medicine, with kindness and love in these difficult, challenging times. To Father Sky, we thank you. We give thanks to the sun for giving the appearance again, for rising in that eastern doorway. Grandfather, Sun, we say thank you for this day. Thank you for this moment. Thank you for the warmth you bring. Thank you for bringing the light. Thank you for everything you do for us, Grandfather, Sun. I thank you for this day, and I stand here as a Anishinaabe man. I give thanks for this moment. If I've done anything in the past, I have this moment to correct it this day, and I thank you, Grandfather, Sun, for this day, this beautiful day, and for making the medicine grow for us, to make our sick get well again. I thank you for this and many other things you do for us, Grandfather, Sun, for this day. I say Miigwech to you from my heart of hearts. I love you. I say Miigwech for this day. So our minds, our hearts can be one with this. I say Miigwech. I send my voices to Nukumis, grandmother of grandmothers. Again, I partition with my Sema. I send my voice to you. You are so beautiful in the night, Nukumis. I love you so much. I give thanks for everything you do for us. I ask for your blessings, Nukumis. I ask you to have pity on us, that we are so pitiful. As I sleep, as my granddaughter sleeps, as we all sleep, you do this for us. So many of us forgotten this. I say miigwech to you for this, Nokomis. As I sleep, as we sleep, you do this for us. You put the waters, the rivers, the lakes, the oceans into order for us. We acknowledge this as the people. We come together for we acknowledge water is life. We have forgotten this, I guess. I ask you to have pity on us, Nokomis. Grandmother of all grandmothers, Grandma Moon, I ask you for your blessings. Again, Grandma, I pray to you. I pray for you. I give thanks for everything you do for us as we sleep. I love you so much. I say miigwech to you. From my heart of hearts, Grandma, I say miigwech. So we come together as the people. We say thank you for this. One mind, one heart. We say thank you. I say thank you to our Creator. Again, Creator, I stand here. I offer my sema in gratitude for everything you do for us. Again, Creator, for there is nothing beyond you, Creator. I say miigwech to you for this beautiful gift you have given us called life. I say thank you for everything, Creator. Again, for there is nothing beyond you, Creator. I ask you to have pity on me, pity on all of us, that we forget so often that you made us the Anishinaabe, the people, before we were anything else. May we always have this in our minds and our hearts. I give thanks for this gift you have given us called life. I send my prayers to all of us and all. We come together as the people. We come together with a good mind, a good heart to listen. We say miigwech to you for this day, this life you have given us, Creator. All my relations. Miigwech, miigwech, miigwech. Thank you for allowing me to say those little words. I say thank you for this. And miigwech.
Merci Cho, Clay, thank you. And thank you for opening us up in a good way. And thank you to all the attendees for signing in and being here today. And on that note, I'd like to welcome Dr. Michael Hart as our monthly Indigenous health speaker for February. I'm so busy, I don't know what month it is. And so Dr. Michael Hart is an eminent scholar and social worker in Indigenous health. I first met Michael, I'm actually not really sure when I first met Michael, but it's been at least probably 10 years, maybe longer. And I'm just thrilled to know him and to work with him. And he's someone that I and many other people have looked up to for years as a mentor, as an idol in Indigenous health. And I'm very excited to have you here. And you've touched my life and the life of everyone else who has had not only the opportunity to know you personally, but also to read your work in a way that makes me feel happy to be alive when sometimes I feel like I'm not really sure why I'm here. So miigwech for bringing that to me. And I'll let you speak now. And I may have to go if we go past 4 because I have other meetings today. But if I'm not able to stay, the Waakabeness Bryce research officer, Robert Loft, will be here to field the questions at the end, if I have to go, that is. So miigwech.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Kanana skimitten Clay, agwa, kanana skimitten Roy. To begin with, I want to acknowledge that Canada is on the territory of Indigenous nations. So we've come together here on Indigenous territories all over this, what is now called Canada. So I'm grateful that we're able to come together. I'm from Ochikwee-CP, Fisher River Cree Nation, which is about 2 hours north of Winnipeg. I want to acknowledge many. Ayisiunyuak miswayutaskik agwa hap mats when kisti ganisak mistagwak pisiskowak kanosiwak venesisak agwa mina manchosak tapwek the mats when miswayutaskik. I'm acknowledging life all over this land, whether there are those who fly or swim, those who are crawling, or those in walking on these lands. I'm acknowledge life all over this land, and grateful to be here with them. I'm happy to have the chance to share some of my thoughts with you on the philosophies of Indigenous practices with Indigenous peoples in the field of mental health. I'm going to jump into it just to make sure that we have time. But before I do, I do want to emphasize how much I appreciate the work of Suzanne, the members of the Ontario NEIHR, for the work that you're doing and to address the well-being of our people, including members of your team, Rob and Roy, for example, and much of the work that they do behind the scenes. I know that we couldn't do things in the way that we can without the support of many people that aren't often seen. But I also acknowledge knowledge keepers such as yourself, Clay, our elders, other elders around who've laid down the groundwork so that we can do our work in a good way. So I do acknowledge the members of the Ontario NEIHR team and other members connected with the NEIHR. To jump into the discussions, I would like to raise a couple of points for consideration, just around the concept of philosophy. I would like us to consider one definition of philosophy. This definition says, philosophy is a set of ideals, standards, values, and beliefs used to describe behavior and thought. The term philosophy is originally a Greek word meaning the love of wisdom. However, the term philosophy cannot be defined precisely as these. Indeed, there are many, many definitions of philosophies. The subject is so complex and indeed, in many ways, controversial. Different philosophers have different views of nature, have different methods. There's a range of philosophy. And yet with this complexity and controversy, it's never stopped European societies and their offshoots, such as Canada or Canadians, from stopping the development of philosophy. And this is an important piece to keep in mind, that despite the lack of agreement, despite the diversity and the complexity and the controversy, that philosophy continues to exist and go forward. Some people say philosophy contains worldviews, or as some refer worldviews as paradigms. So some say philosophy is that overarching pieces overseeing worldviews and paradigms. So some people then see worldviews as a particular paradigm. Yet there's others who see worldviews are larger than philosophies, where philosophy as a whole is but one worldview. Religion would be another example of a philosophy or of a worldview. An individual philosophy of life is another worldview, perhaps. So these are examples of where philosophy isn't a clear concept in of itself. For some, we have relied on other words in order to be less controversial. So I mentioned one, that being worldview. Worldview has become a safe word for many people to use. And supposedly it doesn't connote a particular way to understand concepts like philosophy. And I disagree with that. It does have a particular way to understand concepts. The whole idea of view, within worldview, the whole idea of view privileges the concept of sight. And in turn, it also seems to privilege the concept of thought. This process of renaming things so that they're palatable to other scholars is not unusual in European-based ways. While there is a tendency for people to debate within European practices of philosophy, there's also, as I just said, ways that people try to make things palatable to one another so they can keep going forward. An example is within secular society, philosophers have used the term existential meaning making instead of the word spiritual. And they do this to avoid matters like spirituality and the negative comments one being a scholar, one receives when addressing it in fields like medicine. Yet it's been recognized that spirituality has a positive impact on health outcomes. This is a good example where one's philosophy is impacting how we come to know what we do or what we don't do with what we know. If we're feeling uncomfortable, in other words, sometimes people don't pay attention to things that are really beneficial. Indeed, in light of the complexity of what is philosophy, it should be evident that there are more ideals, standards, values, beliefs than we can cover in a lifetime. We spent lifetimes, indeed, looking at these things in relation to one another, these things being values, beliefs, standards. The trouble, though, that has arisen has been twofold, at least. First, the manner in which we look at ideals, standards, and beliefs itself has become dominated by a spectrum of philosophies and practices such as positivism and reductionism. This first point does not make these philosophies wrong, these philosophies of reductionism or positivism, but it does mean that philosophies are applied in particular ways to the exclusion of other ways. The second troubling area is how philosophy has been guided through the self-serving dynamic through a self-serving dynamic, and this dynamic specifically is egoism and its tool, racism. The late Oglala scholar Vine Deloria Jr. noted that the attitude of many philosophers is that American Indians must represent the stage of human development in which superstition and ignorance reign supreme. Racism is seen as embedded in many philosophical works, and it's acknowledged as being embedded in many philosophical works, including those by renowned scholars as Rousseau, Locke, Kant, and Hegel. Considering the effect to bring systemic processes to an organic concept like philosophy, one would think that relying on some assumptions that entire populations are incapable of developing worthy ideas would be scorned at. As such, much of Indigenous philosophies has been developing in continuation in plain sight, but not seen by European-based philosophers who are blind to their racist spectacles. To make my point, I have to speak in what would be considered overexpanding but suitable generalities in order to be seen as a philosophy that would fit or be acceptable by those who are not of an Indigenous philosophical base. When we look at Western ways of coming to know that dominate globally, I'm not saying they're the only one, but do dominate globally, and for sure in Amero-European, let me start again. When we look at Western ways of coming to know and that dominate globally, and for sure in Amero-European dominated societies like Canada, we can see how there's a different focus on answering such grand philosophical questions like, why are we here? And how should we live? For many Indigenous-based philosophies, the effort to understand and answer these questions are energized differently than those philosophies based from Europe. So what I'd like to go over is a few considerations in terms of Indigenous philosophies. With that said, I do want to emphasize that there is no one Indigenous philosophy, that at least in as many languages, there are likely differences in philosophies. While there's many overlaps, for example, between the Muskego Innuit and Anishinaabe, there's overlaps in how we see and understand some things. There's also some significant differences, as much as there's differences between, for example, the NEIHR and Lakota as there is between France and China, perhaps. So with that said, I'm not saying there's one Indigenous philosophy. And what I'm doing is a few highlights that seem to relate to many of Indigenous philosophies. So amongst these key considerations I want to highlight, one is the role of story. In many Indigenous societies, there are many stories that emphasize that we're all part, that we're not separated, and we're not in a particular order of one greater than the other. Whereas there is evidence to say that there's a sense of hierarchy in European-based ways of being and ways of seeing, ways of doing in the world, Indigenous philosophies tend to not emphasize the hierarchy. It tends to see as all contributing. And you could take a look, for example, at it being winter over here and snow on the ground. Wisaki Jack stories and the Great Flood, and how all had a role, whether it was a beaver, whether it was weasel, whether it's the muskrat, all were able to contribute. There's also differences in terms of it may be similar stories that are shared between nations, between communities, and yet the stories have some variations. And as such, multiple stories are accepted. As I said, some of these are shared in terms of being similar, but some aren't. And so we have very different creation stories. We have different key figures. For example, Wisaki, Jack, Nana, Moju, Raven, etc. But what we do share is stories coming from these about our start of creation and key players in creation. These stories teach about an emphasis on inclusion. So one of the aspects of a creation story shared with me is the whole idea that when any being comes to earth, an aspect of fire is placed within them, and that fire comes from Creator, from creation. And so as such, while there's differences between us, we all have the same source, whether we are Cree, Anishinaabe, French, Japanese, or whether we're a tree or rock, or whether we're a gopher or a giraffe, that we all have this within us, this sacred fire. As such, we're all a part of something. We all have something, and we're all part of it. We all have something to offer that we learn from. Because we all have something to offer and that we're all part of it, then we could learn from all aspects of what is around us, and that the opportunity to learn is always present. So while we acknowledge we are different, but coming from the same source, then we accept that all is a different expression of that source. And as such, all needs to be respected, all needs to be honored. And to recognize the differences also have to be respected and honored, because they may have a different role to play in this world, and indeed all aspects of life. So our stories have much to offer in terms of some of these basic teachings. There's more I could say on stories, and we could come back to that. Another key consideration in terms of Indigenous philosophies is the role of language. And I turn to my own language. Tapwe get the magus and the Motske Guan, Motske Guan Kiskin, then Oma Mosquito and the Moin. Apices Pigo in the here. And I speak only a little bit of my language. And so my understanding is through the elders and what they've shared with me, through my own work as an adult, to try and learn my language. And what I could come to understand from what the elders and speakers have shared with me, and from what I've come to learn in a little bit that I can speak about, is the importance of things being seen in relationship, being active relationships, as opposed to dissecting things up. The English language does has a great focus on dissecting, on breaking things into parts and looking at all of those parts. But when you look at a language such as Cree, there is the emphasis on how things relate to one another. We come to see that, for example, the word love, there's no one, it's based upon the root or the action around love. But that root, sage, is not a word in of itself. It has to be joined with other things. Kisagi din refers to you loved by me. And so there's a number of things that we learn from that whole action then is based upon the relationship involved in that action. So we come to see through the language the importance of relationships, the importance of connecting, and the importance of seeing something happening as opposed to seeing a thing. So we first observe interactions, not things. And since actions are based upon on movement, what we tend to focus is or look at is that movement, and from then we come to see things like growth and change. That's very different than looking at nouns and things, where you may not focus on growth and change in the same way. Another key concept is, or key consideration in terms of Indigenous philosophies I want to raise, is the whole idea of relationships itself. And so coming from the language, we see that, but relationships have a deeper, they imply some deeper things. So for example, things that are in relationship, we come to observe growth and change. What we witness all around us is cycles. We see connections to the land, and we see that as the land changes, it comes back. It's not exactly the same, but there's a lot of similarities. And through that change of watching the land, watching the growth, watching the seasons pass by, for example, we come to see cycles. We watch what grows, we watch it disappear, we watch it come back. I have to express one of my biases. I'm eager to see the snow go and see the warmth come back. We grow and we return, in other words, when we watch these cycles. There is a cycle of spirit then, that as things come up and go back to the earth, we watch that change in spirit, that cycle of spirit. And we also then could see that there's challenges, that come. There's challenges in that growth, and there's challenges to maintain that growth. And what we can anticipate then is that there will be change, and that with change is influenced by and influences change. So a lot of change we see then is tied to pattern, but not all change is tied to a pattern. Some of it is really intense, chaotic, and sudden. We see that in Wee-Sackey Jack stories, for example, where there's a sudden change, or Wee-Sackey Jack tries to do something different, and how that impacts things, and how things have to readjust to find the new pattern or the new cycle going forward. So while most change often comes in patterns, the much change is seen as intense, sometimes chaotic, and for certain it's very sudden. Yes, Suzanne?
My apologies. We've had a few people messaging that they can hear background noise, like a radio or a TV. I don't know. I'm only interrupting because I'm not sure if I need to ask if there's anyone who has, if there's some music or TV or something in another room. Clay, Michael, Roy, anybody?
Not me.
Everybody if it was me. But I don't think it's me. I'm just checking on that. Do you hear it, Michael?
I don't hear anything.
Okay, we'll keep going, and I'll keep trying to fix it. My apologies. Thank you. Carry on. It's fascinating.
Now, where was I? Okay. Another aspect that I want to raise regarding Indigenous philosophies has to do with the role of generations. And that with that growth, with that change, with those cycles and patterns, that over time we could see things come and go. With that then is the understanding about generations, that there's generations to these cycles, that there is an intergeneration relationship in cycles, and that there are generations that have been ahead of us. And that we have a relationship to them, and there's generations to come. That's seen in our language, in the Cree language, for example. Tsapan is often used as a term of endearment referring to our great-grandparents, but Tsapan is also used to refer to our great-grandchildren. And so amongst at least some Crees, the 7 generations has to do with being in the very middle, where I have a responsibility to my Tsapanak, before me and after me. And so that's an example of the importance of generations and the intergenerational relationships. From generations, we could learn about long-held values. And so that's another dimension I want to speak about in terms of Indigenous philosophies. That we have many values identified. So whether we talk about the Anishinaabe 7 grandfather teachings or 7 teachings, or the amongst the NEIHR, the TP teachings, for example. There's many ways that values are demonstrated by different nations and brought forward through metaphors to teach. So the roles of values, I have to emphasize how to be in relationship often. These values are often demonstrated through actions. They're less demonstrated through things. So we value relationships, we value actions, we place less value on things. The role of values is helps us to see particular things we want to emphasize and deem as important or as worthy. Being part of the cycles is valued. And so to understand the cycles, you have to see oneself in relation to all the things around oneself, indeed within oneself. So we come to value a sense of community and being in relationship, where relationship is seen as a verb. But also then, if we're part of cycles, and if we know things are coming and going and returning and going again, amongst the things valued would be patience. Patience for the cycle to move. Patience for one another, as we know that others are in cycles and are in movement. So patience becomes a very important value for many Indigenous peoples. We have to spend time then getting to know how we fit in a larger whole and what actions we want to take to contribute. And our values are going to guide us in terms of how to do the actions, which actions to emphasize, such as relationships, community, and patience. We live out our values every day in what we do. If values are not emphasized as things, but what we do, then we have to live them out in our actions. And in doing that, then we seek out support to live out our values. And perhaps one of the most impactful considerations I want to raise about Indigenous philosophies is that we seek this guidance about learning our values, living our values, is through our ceremonies. So in terms of the role of ceremonies, ceremonies are lived manifestations of our philosophies. They not only reflect and express our stories, whether there are creation stories, whether there are stories about how to fit in with all the cycles around us, they also demonstrate how we have and could live. They are supporting our living today. So our ceremonies not only express stories, but they demonstrate how to live. We often engage in ceremonies to be part of all the cycles around us. There are ways to help ensure that the cycles continue. And so I mean as grand as the cycles of the seasons. We could see that now. We could see the changes human beings are having when we're not considering the cycles and that we're related to them. Global warming is a lack of understanding that we are part of all the cycles and that we impact the cycles and are impacted by them. We have this false idea as in terms of the dominant paradigm, the dominant worldview, dominant way we're living. We have this false idea that we can control nature. And the reality is we live in this mythical assumption that we can control nature. Ultimately, she's going to come back and set an order which makes sense for the greatest life, the greatest degree of life here on earth. So ceremonies help us to ensure the cycles continue. By participating in them, we put our mind, our hearts, our bodies, our spirit in the same set of cycles as the life around us. And then we would start behaving in a way that's consistent with the larger cycles. It is in this way that ceremonies help bring together different cycles by us coming to know our role in these cycles, us knowing how we contribute and influence by and influence the other cycles, we come together with these other cycles. As such, then, ceremonies help us get in sync with the life that's all around us. And this isn't just the life in terms of our families, although that's key. It's all life around us, whether it's the trees, whether it's the birds, whether it's the bugs, etc. Another key aspect is that if things happen in a way that we're not in sync, things could come along and intensely change. We could see intense experiences of change all the time around us, and we're starting to see them even more as we disrupt the cycles more than what the cycles can do to readjust to get back in sync with one another. And so we are impacting, but we will be impacted by these intense changes, and the impacts on us is going to be greater than what we can actually imagine in terms of the impact that we do on other things. So ceremonies then can be manifestations of intense experiences of change. I'll try and come back to that. Some examples of the ceremonies and some values that are guiding and demonstrated in ceremonies. I wanted to go over a few of those. They're also a key aspect of Indigenous philosophies, and not the ceremonies or including the ceremonies themselves, but some of these examples. So what you could see is that many Indigenous nations have ceremonies throughout one whole cycle of a person's life, for example. And this may be welcoming to our nation or a naming ceremony. And the value that often comes with that, like always have troubles with the way. Good child rearing. I'll stick with the English. So welcome to our nation and the naming ceremony and all the dynamics about that, about the connection between the physical and the spiritual in terms of somebody's name and their poagan and the support that comes through naming and the guidance that one could receive through their name. Other ceremonies, whether they may be the walking out ceremony or even the offering of tobacco in of itself. Perhaps when you're crossing a river and the relationship between the waters of the river, the offering to tobacco, and recognizing the interrelationship between the river, the person, and spirit. The first kill, and the giveaway that's tied with the first kill, and the giveaway feast, for example. All of these things are tied in terms of that stage in life when someone is able to take life, be in ceremony around that, but also share that life that has been taken with the rest of the community. And knowing the importance of how that life is taken through hunting, for example, how that is taken and the respect that's needed so that we're not transgressing in our actions, and how we take what we have been given, what's been offered to us from that animal, and how we share that with the rest of our community, and how then we are now even in greater interrelationships. So that whole ceremony of how you go out and hunt, how you take life, the other ceremonies in terms of how you share your first distribution, how you continue to participate in giveaway feasts and giveaway ceremonies. Other ceremonies, be they a berry ceremony or fasting ceremony, and what is learned through those particular ceremonies in terms of coming to understand our sense of purpose, our gifts, those dynamics that are happening in these ceremonies and how we're guided comes through these ceremonies and through certain values, knowing that we go out in isolation and engage in this isolation to come back with something that we could give to our community and to support our community. So while our people have a strong sense of individualism, that sense of individualism is based upon the premise that we grow and develop so that we could give back to the cycles, to our relationships, that meaning our community, our family, etc. Other ceremonies, be they the sweat lodge ceremony, and the whole dynamic that happens in sweat lodge ceremonies in terms of the giving in all aspects, emotional, physical, spiritual, etc. Nipagwesimo in the sun dance, again, these are intense ceremonies that facilitate change and development. So ceremonies play a key role in demonstrating Indigenous philosophies. They involve things such as action, singing, dancing, meditation, prayer, shared words. All of these things then come to contribute back. So what does all this have to do with mental health services? Well, if we look at how mental health services predominate, they reflect that European way of breaking things down to the smallest unit. And often it's exercised through things such as medication or through breaking off in a room or a Zoom call and having a discussion and talking about things. These are the dominant paradigm. And I'm not saying there's something wrong with these. What I would say is that they do reflect a way of practice, a way of engaging in mental health services that reflects, I would say, Amero-European philosophies about wellness, about health, and about change. When an Indigenous mental health practitioner works with somebody to engage in singing, that wouldn't be seen as part of mental health services by many. And yet we know things like singing, as I mentioned, things like, I didn't mention some other things that we're learning, for example, literature that's coming out about the sauna and the impact of heat and cold on people and how that impacts one's life in the positive. There's so many other things that we have not considered that are reflected in Indigenous ways of helping in ceremony, reflected in Indigenous philosophies that could be coming into mental health practices. So when someone goes to spend time with an elder or a knowledge keeper or a traditional practitioner, they may engage in very different ways of mental health services than what we come to expect in Western society. I'm thinking I should probably stop right about there. There's a few other things I could go over, but I'll stop there because I think there's some questions that are coming, and maybe the other parts will come out with some of the answers to the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hart. I just love hearing you speak, and I could listen to you all day and all night, and I have, and I would love to. And I think that there's a lot of questions and comments that come up for people, and there's a few in the chat. But before we get to that, I'd like to ask a question. You know, as an Ontario NEIHR member and an Indigenous mental health researcher, I'm just wondering, you know, what role do you think that ceremony can play in mental health research, for instance, or in health research in general? Because that's something that I think a lot of Indigenous researchers are starting to explore now, given that we are allowed by the system to engage in ceremony within the context of our teaching and our research work. But how, from an Indigenous philosophical perspective, should we be using ceremony in research?
So I need to expand a little bit before I get to that answer. A lot of what our people have experienced historically, as I would imagine most, if not everyone present, would have understand, is the colonial process. And much of the way I would summarize colonization, it was about efforts to disconnect us. So disconnect us from the feelings we have. We're not allowed to have certain feelings. We're told which feelings we can have. Disconnect us from our children, our families, in terms of whether it's residential school, child welfare, or even just the being forced to move from community in order to go get a job. The policies about whether what animals can be taken at what time of year and the impact that has on some Indigenous peoples. So I would suggest that colonization is about disconnection. In order to maintain connection, some Indigenous peoples have had to hide in order to do certain things. So a lot of ceremonies went into hiding. A lot of elders that carry knowledge went into hiding. I know some of them moved further, deeper into the bush, for example. And the reason that the hiding and that kind of separation was a separation from the colonial process is in order to maintain their own values, their own Indigenous philosophies, their own practices. What we have now is that there's been a change where we're not thrown in jail, we're not put down to the same degree. I think many people still are put down, and unfortunately that's sometimes by some of our own people who have internalized those colonial processes. But overall, we're not facing the same kind of barriers to the same degree. So as such, more people are willing to be more open to speak about, to engage in some of our own ways. Where we're at, I believe, is that whether we come to see research as something that is going to be respectful for our people. And so the challenge is that not just only on the Indigenous helping philosophy side, but also in terms of the role of research and what it can do to help. And so there's much work that's been done to look at Indigenous ways of coming to know and in our own practices, whether it's Kathy Absalon's work or whether it's Maggie Kovach's work about research and many others, Wilson's work, etc. There's many individuals that are trying to make sure that research is reflective of our Indigenous practices. It becomes more challenging when there's a disconnection between the philosophies behind the research and the philosophies of the practice. And it's not that it can't be done, but we have to be cognizant of the disconnect in terms of how we do research and how and what we are researching. And long as we're trying to be as open as possible out of all of that, I think some good could come out of that. So we're facing a number of things and we're moving forward very cautiously in terms of how much do we reveal, how much is appropriate to reveal, both within maintaining the what's within the practice, I'll say, but also with what we want to share openly. We're still in those processes. So to me, then the answer comes is you have to engage with community so they could define how much they want to engage in. And you have to engage in a way that's consistent with the community values and ways of doing things. Those have to come first before we're engaged in all the research practices. For us as a NEIHR then, that means expanding how we are going to do the research that's inclusive of Indigenous research methodologies and that it's community-based, meaning that it's going to be done in a way that the community wants done and in a way that it's going to benefit the community. And keeping in mind we're with many communities and no one answer is going to fit all the communities. So it requires a lot of flexibility on our side as researchers.
Great, thank you. I could keep asking about that, but maybe we'll do that. Okay. There are more questions in the chat. So one is, this is a question and I'll read it directly. As a non-Indigenous person working as a mental health practitioner, what advice would you give to start decolonizing our practice?
This has been a standing question I've been asked throughout all of my years as a practitioner, academic and researcher. And my answer hasn't changed much. It's recognizing that we all come in with the values. We all come in with values. We all come in with preconceived ideas, and we're not often taking time to understand the values and practices and preconceived ideas that we come in with. And so the first stage, in my eyes, for a non-Indigenous person, same with me as an Indigenous person working with non-Indigenous peoples, is to know where I come from and what I'm coming in with, so that I have a better understanding when I'm taking something and imposing it upon somebody with a different value set, a different practice set, a different way of being in the world. If I don't have an understanding of myself, then the potential for me to be imposing is greater. In addition, I have to understand that I'm in a position of privilege, of power, where I get to decide how to utilize the tools that society, in this case Canadian society, recognizes, and how I get to decide how to use them, when to use them, and that I come with a particular set of tools that Canadian society is recognizing, and that there's other sets of tools that are being ignored and not recognized. So a Sundance host isn't recognized as being able to provide something in terms of the Canadian context. To recognize we come in then with power, privileges, tools, values, beliefs, and potentially we're going to be imposing them. So part of decolonizing is understanding all of the dynamic of who we are and what we have in relation to those who are colonized.
Massey Cho, I'm going to try to sneak one more in. Are there any recommendations for resources to learn more about Indigenous philosophy and mental health, such as books or articles?
You could probably answer this even better than me, Suzanne. So I'm going to think of a few things that come to mind. I'm not sure if I would suggest any one that the first thing is diving into it and coming to understand some of the dynamics that I just mentioned in a previous answer. So learning about just what is colonization, what is decolonization, and there's much literature that's available around that. But I would look at work of Leanne Simpson, for example, Dancing on Turtle's Back, to get an Indigenous perspective on some of those things. I would look at Sylvia McAdams' book, Nationhood Interrupted, for example, for another perspective. So there's a variety of pieces like that. But there's other pieces such as, I forget his first, Louis Bird's books about the importance of Indigenous stories and what they're all about, to have that kind of perspective. Before I would jump into anything like Louis' work or work specifically based within Indigenous ways, it's that you have to understand the colonial pieces first, because if you don't, then it ends up becoming exercises of voyeurism, and so there's always that cycling back to look at why we're engaging in something and coming to understand why we're looking at something. But my first parts I would suggest is looking at some of the colonialism literature, racism literature, and understanding the dynamics of power. There's probably many more, there are many more, not probably, there are many more pieces that I could offer, but I think that's a starting place.
Wonderful, Massey Cho, for those answers. And thank you, Dr. Hart, for your wonderful words and experiences and knowledge that you've shared with us. I've been writing everything down and listening to what you're saying. And it is recorded and will be archived on the NEIHR website, which I think Roy can put in the chat if you don't already know what our website is. But Roy, if you wouldn't mind putting that in the chat for us. And I will invite Clay to make some concluding comments and to close us in a spiritual way before we end the webinar.
Back. Oh, I'm back. I never went anywhere. I was just wandering around in the woods there, listening. Thank you, Dr. Michael Hart, for those beautiful words and everything. I really don't have much to say about comment, and it was such, again, a privilege to hear you speak and perspective, and I love. It brought me back home to hear that bit of that Cree accent you have, because I lived here in the East so long and I don't have that anymore. so all of that, and I appreciate that, and the land, and it made me think about all the Cree stories that I heard and everything in my life. But thank you again for that, and it is it's so wonderful to hear those stories again, which you mentioned. So, Miigwech, thank you for allowing me to well, I was going to say hi. So I'm so used to in embracing my Potawatomi Ojibwe roots, and so all of that. So I'll just close and again with this. Wherever we are, wherever you are, the people here, and everything. And it's just take a moment or two and just give thanks. You know, again, we are in these difficult, challenging times, but that's what Michael said, is that we've always adapted. And that's the beauty that that's what I heard, is that we've always adapted. We always are well as Indigenous people. I'll use that word, as Cree, as Ojibwe, and all the other nations. And that's one of the beauties that I always reminded of, is how much we adapt. We adapted so much, and we're going to keep on adapting. And because it's just, that's what we're doing, and it's so beautiful to see and hold on to our values and our tradition and our philosophies. And they're, like you were saying, they're very diverse, but we have always adapted, and we always will. And so we're always looking for people to help and support that. And there is a dark chapter in Canadian history, and so I'm glad that you brought that to light, and talking about that, and saying, look, we need to, for this country, for everything, we need to talk about it to go forward, to heal, and all of this. So, and it's difficult for a lot of us right now, and because we're all isolated, and we're trying to do the best we can, as often as we can, as frequently as we can, to keep going, and all of that. So I encourage everyone to just remember what was said here today, and take what you need, and disregard the rest, right? And so we just say miigwech to you. And so with that, I just say miigwech to our Creator for getting us together. Right? I say miigwech to our Creator, the earth, the sun, the sky, and everything in between earth and sky. Our four-legged friends, our crawler friends, our swimmer friends, our flyer friends, our relatives. We acknowledge them. We thank them for everything they provide for us in the past, in the present, and the future. We say thank you to them. We give thanks to our Mother, the Earth, for providing everything for us. I thank her from my heart of hearts. I say miigwech to you, and I ask, as just a Anishinaabe man, to ask for blessings for all of us, and to bless our families, our children, wherever we may be, all of us who have come together in this virtual ceremony. I say thank you for this, for allowing me to say this. I say with humbleness, I say thank you, Creator, for this day. All my relations, miigwech, people. See you all at the next one.
Miigwech. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.